save your soul. Lord knows from winter in America, the Constitution, a noble piece of paper with free society, struggle but they died in vain. And now democracy is a ragtime on the corner, hoping for some rain. It looks like he's hoping for some rain. And I see the robins perched in barren treetops. They're watching last-ditch races marching across the floor. But just like the peace sign that vanished in our dreams, never had a chance to grow. Never had a chance to grow. And now it's winter. It's winter in America. And all of the healers have been killed or betrayed. Yeah, but the people know it's winter. Lord knows it's winter in America. And ain't nobody fighting, 'cause nobody knows what to say. Save your soul from the winter in America. Stick. And now it's winter. Winter in America. And all of the healers done been killed, sent away. Yeah, the people know it's winter. Winter in America. And ain't nobody fighting, 'cause nobody knows what to say. And ain't nobody fighting, 'cause nobody knows. And ain't nobody fighting, 'cause nobody knows what to say.
All right. Let me pull up my script. All right, welcome everyone. I'm Dante O'Hara. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an organizer with the Claudia Jones School for Political Education based in Washington, DC. And we are excited to host tonight's event along with our friends and comrades at the Sankofa Video, Books, and Cafe located on Georgia Avenue in DC and the DC local of the Industrial Workers of the World, otherwise known as the IWW or the Wobblies. Tonight's event is called The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly, Ben Fletcher. For those who are unaware, the Claudia Jones School for Political Education is a grassroots educational organization committed to building the political consciousness of the DC metropolitan community We strive to be a force in the fight against injustices of a racist ruling class engaged in a relentless class war against the working poor whose labor is the source of all capital that is used against the same workers and furthering their exploitation. The Claudia Jones School creates spaces for folks to engage in radical politics and further develop their class and socialist consciousness. We will also like to acknowledge the people upon whose land the Claudia Jones School exists. This is the land of the Nacotchtank people, from which the name Anacostia is drawn. The closest surviving First Nations people are the Piscataway Nation, who holds their annual celebrations in Accokeek, Maryland. With that being said, I would like to do a few housekeeping items before we get started. I will be facilitating this event while we have other organizers in the background, moderating the chat and the YouTube live stream. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a tab for the Q&A and a chat box, which you can insert comments and questions and engage with the dialogue. This will also be recorded so we can have it available for people who are not able to make it tonight and attendees that want it for future reference. It is also being live streamed on our YouTube channel for those who are not able to log into the Zoom link. With that being said, I will now introduce our guest for this evening, Professor Peter Cole. Peter Cole is a professor of history at Western Illinois University and a research associate in the Society, Work and Development Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Cole is the author of the award-winning book, Dockworker Power, Race and Activism in Durban and the San Francisco Bay Area and Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Era Philadelphia. And he also co-edited The Wobblies of the World, A Global History of the IWW. He is founder and co-director of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project. His new book, Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly, just published by PM Press and originally was issued by Charles H. Kerr Press. And with that, I would like to pass the floor to Peter Cole. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone to be here. I appreciate your time and attention. And thanks, of course, to the Claudia Jones School for Political Education for hosting this event, as well as co-sponsors, the IWW chapter in DC and Sankofa Books, as well as my publisher, PM Press. I'm gonna give you a talk, and then there's plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So I'll share my screen here. And, all right, let's see if I can do that. It's a pleasure again to talk about this book, Ben Fletcher, which just came out this week, actually. Ben Fletcher was one of the most important leaders in the IWW, and in particular in Local 8, which was its most effective interracial union. And that controlled the Philadelphia waterfront for over a decade through its militancy and direct action tactics. Fletcher is also one of the most important Black labor figures in US history, yet few people, even on the left, know his name. But he couldn't be more relevant to our times, and I hope you'll agree by the end of my talk. If only I could advance the slide. So the industrial workers of the world, let me tell you a little about the industrial workers of the world. I put Ben Fletcher squarely at the center of organizing in the IWW and thinking about the IWW.
Hey, Peter.
Yes.
We lost your slides. I don't know if you were still showing.
Oh, I'm trying to, but thank you for telling me. All right. Hopefully now you can see the screen.
Yes, we can see it.
But what we want to do is, of course. All right. Sorry, my apologies. So the IWW, was established in 1905 and is deeply important for us to think about because, well, let me explain. In 1905 is when the IWW was founded. 1905, 115 years ago today, let me sort of paint a brief picture. It was a time of extreme inequality in the United States. In particular, corporations dominated the country had for the last generation or so, creating incredible wealth for a small group of people who we could call capitalists. There was almost no government regulation whatsoever, and frequently capitalists did the bidding of corporations, including dispatching the US Army as well as police on a regular basis. The working class at this time was very, very weak. There were very few Americans in unions, and most of those who were in unions belonged to the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor, however, chose to not organize women, chose to not organize African Americans, chose to not organize most immigrants, chose not to organize most unskilled workers. They were primarily interested in improving the wages and sort of power of their small number of members. And this was often called bread and butter unionism, because they had no sort of larger political project. They solely were interested in improving the wages for their members. In addition to this, racism was rampant. This is just 9 years after Plessy v. Ferguson was passed by the US Supreme Court, or ruled upon. Immigration was high, and xenophobia was growing. At the IWW's founding convention in 1905 in Chicago, there was a host of sort of all-star radicals, including Eugene Debs, one of the founders of the Socialist Party, but before that had been the leader of the largest strike in the late 1800s, the Pullman strike in 1894. Mother Jones, the labor organizer and socialist, and also sort of activist against child labor. Lucy Parsons, the anarchist, who's was the widow of Albert Parsons, who was one of the Haymarket martyrs in 1886-87. Big Bill Haywood, the leading coal sort of mine worker union in the West, not coal miners, hard rock miners. And all these people came together in Chicago in 1905. I'm talking to you from Chicago, because they believed that the system was inherently unjust and could not be reformed. It couldn't be fixed, right? Instead, they called for what they referred to as the abolition of the wage system, which is to say that socialism was the solution, capitalism was the problem. The IWW also understood that capitalism was global, right? And so therefore fashioned itself as an international union from its inception. That's why it called itself the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. They thought about and actually debated at their founding convention, calling themselves the Industrial Workers of America, but decided against that because they believed that that was too nationalist. Whereas even at the founding convention, there were people from outside of the United States who were present. The IWW was socialist because they believed that essentially the system was inherently unjust. This classic poster from 1911 gives us a little taste of what the IWW was thinking, but not only the IWW, but other socialists who essentially believed that the great majority of people in a capitalist system worked and created wealth, but didn't profit from it, right? The IWW also believed that the only solution was organizing all workers into a single union, the one big union, right? And they also believed that the sort of the path to the sort of new society that they envisioned and dreamed of was actually not through electoral politics or even through a political party. In this way, the IWW was much more anarchist-ish, if not anarchist, than many others on the left, including the socialists and later the communists. Instead, they believed that the most powerful tool that workers had was the strike, and therefore, ultimately, that a radical change would come through a general strike. Now, focusing a little on the IWW before I sort of provide a little background on a few other related subjects. The IWW, therefore, in contrast to the AFL, was created from the start as being anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-nationalist, anti-xenophobic. They often made fun of the AFL, which they nicknamed the American Separation of Labor as opposed to the American Federation of Labor. And so the IWW believed, as did other socialists, and as do other socialists, that essentially one's class identity would take precedence over other identities that people had. And the IWW in Philadelphia, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes, on the waterfront of Philadelphia, where about 4,000, 5,000 workers toiled, was about 1/3 Black, 1/3 Irish and Irish American, and 1/3 European immigrants of different places. In this multi-ethnic, multiracial workforce, generally employers win in the United States and in other diverse societies. Employers have time and time again used the working class's diversity against it, right, in order to divide and conquer. right? The Wobblies understood this, other socialists understood this, but what made the Wobblies notable, especially in Philadelphia on the waterfront, is that they actually put these ideas into practice in a way that few other had in that era. So before we talk about the Philadelphia waterfront, let me tell you a little about the maritime industry, which is a subject that I've researched and thought about for the last 20, 25 years or so. If you think about it, shipping is the first great industry in a capitalist world, right? In the 15th and 16th centuries, it was the ship, the technology, the most powerful and sort of important ships of that era that sailed from Western Europe to literally conquer the world, as well as to spread its economic system that was evolving simultaneously. And so we can understand that capitalism and imperialism rise simultaneously, resulting in the next 500 years of world history, right? The origins of the word strike tells us a lot about the centrality of shipping also. In the 1700s, London was becoming the most important port city in the most powerful empire in the world, Britain. And in 1768, in the Port of London, when sailors wanted to get a raise, they took down the sails of their ship in order to stop work. And the nautical term for taking down the sails of one ship is to strike the sail. And so the de facto word in the English language for a labor stoppage is strike, but it also actually is nautical in its origins. And that tells us a lot about the centrality of this industry, I would say in the 21st century too, right? And so we study the past to understand the present and to change the future, right? And even today, 90% of the goods that we consume are moved by ship for at least part of their life. The last thing I'll say about shipping is keeping in mind that because shipping is part of the transportation industry, this gives power to workers, right? Because, as you know, the ship must sail on time. And as you know, time is money, right? Everyone understands this, including workers, right? Dock workers in particular were very savvy. So dock workers, classic image from Philadelphia in the early 20th century, also called longshore work because it was along the shore. At this time, it was all male. And so it was common to call them longshoremen. So longshoring was a tough job, right? I'm going to read you a quote from John Walsh, one of Ben Fletcher's friends and fellow organizers in Philadelphia. The man has got to pull from 5 to 8 to 1,000 pounds on hand trucks down the hold of a ship. It's nothing new for a man to haul. Well, they don't haul in hand trucks. They carry the freight down the hold of the ships. You carry anything from a 200-pound bag of potatoes, 280-pound bags of flour, 380-pound bags of San Domingo sugar carried right on their backs. Handle big cases of bacon weighing 500 pounds, and you got to go right up against the list of the ship when it comes. Also, importantly, this work was temporary, often called casual, sometimes now called precarious, which is to say that you got hired by the job, you got hired to do that ship, maybe for the day, maybe for a week, but after that, there was no guarantee you'd have another job, right? And so there's no steady employment in this industry. It was, in fact, one of the many reasons that employers had such power. Right. Another reason employers had power is they controlled the hiring process, which was called in Philadelphia and across the United States as the shape up. The shape up basically meant that hundreds, perhaps, of workers might show up for dozens of jobs, right? When the employer wants to pick workers for the jobs, they can basically pick and choose their favorites. That might be someone who shares the same race, someone who shares the same religion, someone who offers a bribe, etc. Right? Workers understood that the shape up stunk. They just didn't have the power to get rid of it. But because so many people could do the work, labor surpluses in American cities were common. Not only was there European immigration at a very high rate in the early 20th century, there was also literally millions of Americans from rural areas who are moving to cities in the same time period, right? And the effects of these was that this huge labor surplus kept wages low and workers weak. However, once workers got work, they worked in teams, in pairs and in gangs. And it's important to appreciate that many occupations are more individualistic. I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator. I do a lot of my work by myself, very individually. By contrast, dock work, loading and unloading a ship, takes a group, takes a team. And so the nature of the work developed a sort of a collective identity, which is important to understand. And it's also important to understand that there was a clear class divide between employers and employees. No one goes from a dock worker to a ship owner. Let me repeat, No one goes from a dock worker to a ship owner. And so there wasn't any false notion that they could advance in the so-called social mobility of the United States. Instead, they understood sort of more clearly that this was us versus them. So let me tell you about Ben Fletcher, the subject of this talk, hypothetically. So Ben Fletcher was born in Philadelphia in 1890. His parents were African-Americans who had moved from Virginia a few decades prior, or maybe just years prior. We're actually not sure when his parents moved to the city of Philadelphia, but we know they were from Virginia, and we could guess that they were fleeing the sort of horrors of racism in their home state of Virginia. We do know that Ben Fletcher's father was actually from the eastern shore of Virginia, which has a very long history of maritime connections, both the Virginia and Maryland eastern shores. And so it's not inconceivable that Ben Fletcher's father actually worked on the waterfront or worked aboard a boat or a ship. We can't know for sure, but it's actually quite reasonable to conclude. The most famous African-American from the eastern shore of Maryland was Frederick Douglass. And of course, he escaped by sea on a boat along the Chesapeake, and later worked in the industry, in the whaling industry, right in Massachusetts. So I also want to highlight that the city of Philadelphia is an interesting place. Philadelphia had the largest Black population in the country outside of the South in the early 1900s, although New York City would later surpass it. It was a place, however, that despite its large Black population was notoriously racist and also very anti-union. And so we keep these things in mind when we think about the rise of local 8. So Ben Fletcher was born again in 1890, around the age of 20 or 21. He joined the Industrial Workers of the World, and he joined the Socialist Party of the United States, which at that time was quite common. Remember that Eugene Debs was actually a co-founder of the IWW, and that a lot of people thought that you could play in both worlds. I'm not saying you can't, right? Why Fletcher becomes a radical at this age, we can't be sure. I wish I did. I wish I could say I know for sure. It's very reasonable to conclude that he was spending time in his home neighborhoods in South Philadelphia, which was teeming with working class people and immigrants and factories, right? And he saw the oppression going on, both of Black people, but also working people. It's actually quite common at that time, and it's easy to imagine that he would have heard soapbox speakers, people who stood up on small boxes on street corners, like pictured on the bottom, and was able to sort of basically be convinced and join the IWW. We know he worked as a day laborer and a longshoreman. And we also know that by 1912, he already was being featured in IWW newspapers as a prominent speaker. So at the age of 22, he was already becoming very well known as a young Black radical. By the way, Fred Hampton was 21, right? When he was killed, the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago. So I sometimes compare Fletcher to Fred Hampton, right? They were around the same age. They both became African-American revolutionaries, right? So in 1913, Ben Fletcher was a part of the first important strike in the history of Local 8. So in the spring of 1913, it was common for strikes to break out in the spring. After the winter, when shipping was low, that was when basically shipping started to pick up, which was an opportunity for workers to exploit basically the sort of increasing business in order to press employers for things like a raise. Most of the Philadelphia waterfront workforce went out on strike in the second half of May 1913, maybe about 4,000 men. And it was during this moment that the members of the strike decided to join the IWW. They considered joining the AFL, which had a longshore union rival, but instead they joined the IWW, which was one of the most important decisions they might have made. Why they did so, I'm actually not certain either. No one really knows, but Ben Fletcher was already there, and we could guess that actually he had an important role to play in convincing many people. He had experience already organizing among white majority workforces, but he also, of course, as an African-American, could convince African-Americans to sort of that the IWW was for real. The IWW actually already had a history of organizing multi-ethnic workers, Asian workers, Mexican workers, as well as African-American workers. And so they had proven to be anti-racist as opposed to simply speaking the lingo, if you will. But nevertheless, in the spring of 1913, the IWW charters this Local 8, which was part of the Marine Transport Workers Division. And this is really the sort of the beginning of the rise of Ben Fletcher as an important figure. So as soon as the IWW took power in Philadelphia on the waterfront, they instituted a host of important changes to further implement anti-racist policies and practice, right? For one, they integrated work gangs. Before this time, it was common for gangs to be segregated based on race and ethnicity. So you, for instance, you have an Irish gang, a Polish gang, an Italian gang, a black gang, and those gangs were often pitted against each other by the bosses. Hey, look, those Polish guys are working faster than you. I thought you black guys are hard workers, right? Of course, who wins in that game? The employer wins because they work harder, they work faster, they get paid less because you're getting paid by the hour, right? The IWW integrated work gangs. Let me highlight that this is 1913. This is 52 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or whatever that is, 51 years, right? So 50 years before the federal government said that we should integrate our society, Local 8 did it by itself. They did so because they had the power and because they believed in it, and they did so in opposition to the employers, right? They also integrated their leadership, so they mandated that basically they would have an equal number of white and black elected leaders at events, as well as at meetings, as well as in the elected officials. And they also, according to reports, integrated their social events. This began the process of breaking down the racism and xenophobia that already existed in Philadelphia. In addition, Local 8 abolished the shape-up, which dock workers hated, right? Instead, employers would have to call up the Local 8 union hall, which had a telephone, right? And request workers, please send 100 workers to unload coffee beans at Pier 34 tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., right? And so workers controlled the dispatch, and workers became more loyal to themselves and their union instead of being loyal to their bosses, right? The IWW had very low dues because it was a revolutionary group and they wanted to attract as many people as possible. But they wanted to make sure that you were a member, and so they issued a monthly button, and if you didn't have the right button, you wouldn't be assigned ships. But if employers tried to hire non-union scab workers on the side, well, the Wobblies who were on the ship could see who was a member and who wasn't, right? And basically they would, there's documented reports of them stopping work to force employers to fire the non-Wobblies, right? The Wobblies, in other words, not ever signing contracts would enforce their power on the job, what was called direct action, through things like a strike, right? They also did things to celebrate themselves. So on the first anniversary of their founding strike, they declared a holiday. They basically told the bosses on a Saturday that they weren't going to go to work. The bosses said, well, if you don't go to work today, you don't come to work tomorrow. But they went on strike anyway. And by the afternoon, employers were already asking them to come back to work. This is not unique to the Local 8. These are IWW tactics that the Local 8 membership led by Ben Fletcher were instituting, right? As I already said, they didn't have, the IWW didn't want to sign contracts because they didn't want to sacrifice workers' most powerful weapon, which was the strike, right? Or the threat of a strike, right? And so this direct action was one of the tactics that was used by the IWW wherever it had the power to do so, right? And by having only oral agreements instead of signed contracts, they basically retained their power. I do want to highlight that what was happening in Philadelphia and across the United States was happening actually in many places. That especially IWWs who were sailors were literally bringing these ideas to countries around the world in the early 1900s. Very quickly, the IWW spread to more than 24 countries. But these are examples of the Little Red Songbook from Finland and a really wonderful photograph of a New Zealand mine workers hall that was part of the IWW. In addition to sort of bringing these revolutionary union ideas, in New Zealand, for example, the IWW was the first union to try to organize Maori workers, right? And so it wasn't only in the United States that the IWW was anti-racist, it was also in other places that they organized. Ben Fletcher in particular was in high demand because he was the most well-known African-American in the entire IWW. And he was regularly sent to other ports in order to organize workers on the docks, but also more generally so, right? And so he was sent to Boston, he was sent to New York, he was sent to Providence, he was sent to Baltimore repeatedly, he was sent down to Norfolk, etc. It was in Norfolk that one of the more dramatic incidents in his life occurred. This is early 1917, before the United States declared war. Fletcher was actually in Baltimore and then went down to Norfolk from Baltimore because he had been essentially invited by local workers. The dock workforce in Norfolk and further south was predominantly African-American, right? While Fletcher was organizing one day in Norfolk, Virginia, he heard that he might be lynched, that he might be murdered, right? And so Fletcher was a radical labor organizer and a Black man in the South, right? And of course, in the 19 teens, there were dozens of lynchings that happened every year, right? And so when Fletcher hears that he might get lynched, this is not some idle threat, right? He actually got aboard a ship the same night for Boston, which was where actually he was arrested or first spied on by the federal government once World War I began in April of 1917. And by the summer of 1917, he's under surveillance, right? Fletcher was one of more than 150 IWW members who was indicted by the federal government for laws passed right after the war began called the Espionage and then later Sedition Acts that basically criminalized dissent. So in other words, to be critical of the war, despite the First Amendment, could get you imprisoned. The most well-known person to suffer that fate was Eugene Debs, right, who for speaking out against the war in 1918 was given a 10-year sentence. Ben Fletcher also was very well known when he was part of this 1918 huge trial in Chicago that lasted for 4 months. He would remark to Big Bill Haywood, who was the most well-known Wobbly on trial in the summer of 1918, things like, if I wasn't here, there'd be no color at all in this trial because he was only African American on trial. And then when the judge started to read sentences out at the end of their trial, Fletcher leaned over to Big Bill Haywood and said something like, "The judge doesn't use very proper grammar. His sentences are way too long." These jokes became repeated multiple times throughout the Wobbly literature and in Big Bill Haywood's memoir and many other places in the 19 teens and 20s. Fletcher, sentenced to prison, like all the Wobblies who were on trial that day or that month or that year, Fletcher got 10 years and $30,000 fine, which would be more like a couple $100,000 in the 21st century. Oh, something just happened. So Ben Fletcher and about 100 other IWW members were sent on a train from Chicago immediately in the fall of 1918 to the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. Fort Leavenworth, of course, originally was a base that the US Army used to sort of attack Indians, but then had been turned into a federal penitentiary. Fletcher was sort of around a bunch of other folks who were in prison at that time. There were communists, there were anarchists, there were religious objectors, there were African-American soldiers who were convicted of treason for resisting racism in Houston, Texas. There was also the legendary Mexican revolutionaries and anarchists, Ricardo Flores Magón. And although Fletcher doesn't talk about his time in Leavenworth very much, this is what Magón had to say about being at Leavenworth. He was caught by the formidable mechanism of a monstrous machine, and my flesh may get ripped open and my bones crushed and my moans fill the space and make the very infinite shudder, but the machine will not stop grinding, grinding, grinding. While in prison, Ben Fletcher corresponded with many people, and thanks to the federal government basically keeping records on his correspondence, but also transcribing all of his letters. It's ironic that historians looking back can actually use these federal spies in order to sort of learn about these radicals like Ben Fletcher. But in one letter he wrote on New Year's Eve, right before 1920, which of course was just 2 years after the birth of the Soviet Union, the Mexican Revolution, the attempted revolutions in Hungary and Germany and other places. We are living in momentous times. None of us are gifted with the power of clairvoyancy as to be able to foretell the day or the hour. Therefore, the first and most important duty is for all of us to prepare ourselves for the final chapter in the life of capitalism. So while Fletcher was in prison, the IWW continued to sort of represent dock workers in the city of Philadelphia. And Local 8 was so powerful that even though Fletcher and 5 other leaders were imprisoned, the Navy even only used IWW members into the early 1920s, right? To sort of move a little faster, the dock workers in Philadelphia actually went on strike in 1920, and then again in late 1922 were locked out by the bosses, who received incredible and large support from the federal government and the city government, as well as from their rival union. Racism was also sort of increasingly rampant, as well as xenophobia, and so a series of forces result in Local 8 being split asunder and no longer having the power to represent dock workers in the majority of dock workers in Philadelphia. Racism actually will grow dramatically in the 1920s. The Ku Klux Klan will become an organization that has several million members, not just in the South, but across the country, including in Philadelphia and Eastern Pennsylvania. And so the IWW continued to fight the Klan, literally and figuratively, but nevertheless wasn't strong enough to sort of protect its members in Philadelphia. And so after a number of years of not having a union, the AFL-L's rival union to the IWW, the International Longshoremen's Association, reorganized the Philadelphia waterfront. They did deliver some benefits like an 8-hour day and some union representation. However, they allowed the shape up to return. They allowed segregated gangs to return. And according to reports from the Urban League, neighborhoods that previously had been more peaceful and accommodating to African Americans increasingly became more racist, violent places. Somewhere along the way, we're not entirely sure, Ben Fletcher will move around 1930 or 31 to New York City. He is still active in the IWW at that time. We have reports of him giving speeches in the 30s in New York City and other places. However, when he was just in his mid 30s, he suffered, I should say in his mid 40s, sorry, a major stroke. He also reports in correspondence to friends, various other health ailments. You know, working class people got very poor healthcare at that time. He'd worked heavy labor for some years, and generally those sorts of people have more health problems than others. African Americans also generally have gotten very poor health treatment in the American system. And so Fletcher is actually in poor health for many years. He's around, he's active, he's sort of has a lot of wobbly friends and whatnot. Here, the image on the right is actually him posing with visiting a friend in New Jersey whose kid he's holding in his hand, right? But Fletcher isn't very active anymore, even though he continues to be, according to all reports, very much committed to the IWW, very much committed to really a socialist future. When he died in 1949 in Brooklyn, New York, where he lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there was a lot of obituaries that came out about him. Interestingly, even the New York Times actually did an obituary about him, even though it was really the better part of 30 years since he had been an important labor figure. Fletcher is an interesting person because some people are critical of Local 8 for basically not being radical enough. Other people consider it too radical. And Fletcher himself was sort of at some times considered too pragmatic and at other times considered too revolutionary, right? We know that Fletcher, based on his actions, his words, and his deeds, right, was clearly committed to fighting racism and xenophobia within the working class. But we also know that he never stopped believing that only a united working class would be powerful enough to overcome the capitalist class, but that wouldn't just happen, right? And so his ultimate goal remained really sort of abolishing the wage system, as the IWW said in 1905, even though really by the mid-30s, he's no longer an active player in these games. So Ben Fletcher believed in the working class and its capacity. He never wavered from his belief that capitalism would end and that only an organized working class, especially through unions, could end it. He also never stopped fighting against racism and xenophobia and believed that working people who were divided based on these racist and xenophobic ideas only weakened themselves and only benefited the working class. Only benefited the ruling class. And so with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for my miscues, but hopefully you got the general idea. Cheers.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I assume everyone that's on the attendee list learned a lot from this talk. And for folks who don't know anything about Ben Fletcher, obviously you can return back to this presentation, but I'd highly recommend picking up one of Professor Cole's copies of his new book, or new edition to his book that just came out today, you said, right? So it's on, PM Press has a 50% discount, so this is the time to buy it, I think. And I'm not sure if Sankofa, I know they're co-sponsoring this event, but I'm assuming they may buy some copies to sell at their store as well. So, and I want to give a shout out to all the Wobblies on the chat. I'm not a Wobbly myself, but solidarity to all your work. And this was a very enjoyable discussion, and I'm hoping people learn more about the history of the Wobblies and Ben Fletcher, obviously, as well. So I have a few pre-prepared questions, but if folks want to have some, once we move into the Q&A with the audience questions, feel free to start filling in the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. All right, so the first question I have is an interesting question that people think about. Well, radicals on the left, I think about a lot historically and currently. Ben Fletcher's experience with federal agents when handing out literature has an eerie resemblance to another Black radical named Angelo Herndon, who was arrested for sedition and inciting a riot for organizing an unemployment and hunger march in Georgia. And I believe this was in the 1930s or late 1920s, I forget exactly. But how can we tie the interlocking repressive measures of anti-Black racism and anti-communism, in this case for Ben Fletcher, syndicalism and radicalism?
So that's a very important question. And I think it's really the original reason that I was drawn to Local 8 and Ben Fletcher was sort of this nexus of race and class conversations, right? Like, and it's unfortunate for many people for many, many years. Some people think it's sort of one or the other. And for me and for many other people, but this goes back, of course, to W.E.B. Du Bois and others, right? Is that you don't need to sort of separate these things out. You have to understand that these things are combined, and in the same way that so too in the repressive nature of the system, right? Like, and so, you know, an attack on Black people can be done through racist means or through sorts of red baiting. Yeah, red's the color of the sort of the left, even though many anarchists take the color of Black, right? Like, and so I think we have to always keep in mind, right, that anyone who's watching, right, like, all right, they're being attacked. Well, it's going to happen to me next, right? This is sort of also, these aren't unique thoughts, right? But in the World War I era, right, during World War I, the IWW was the first group targeted by the federal government. Later, they came for the communists, anarchists, and others, right? But really, they first went after, in the first Red Scare, the IWW was considered to be, that's of course why the Communist Party of the United States and the Soviet Union wanted the IWW to join the communists after World War I, is because they were already the most revolutionary organization in the United States, right? Like, of course, as we know, fast forwarding to the late 1940s, African Americans on the left were at the forefront of the red baiting then, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, but even more importantly, Paul Robeson and others were sort of targeted, right? And so what we've got here is a line, right? We could just draw the line, right? Like from, you know, sort of the persecution of Ben Fletcher and other Wobblies in the late teens. We can draw the line to Herndon, as you said, and Harry Haywood and others who were African-American communists. We can draw the line further into the late 40s. We can draw the line into the late 60s, right? Where the Nixon administration, we know this because of interviews, very clearly said, we targeted the left, you know, which of course was leading the anti-war movement, right, as well as supporting the civil rights movement, by basically sort of calling them un-American, as well as using the original war on drug actually was really to sort of attack the civil rights activists and the anti-war activists, right? Like, and so we are stupid if we let us get this happen to us again, right? Like, I mean, and so there's, in every generation, we've seen this, right? And we saw it obviously in the most recent election where if there were so many socialists in America, right, you would think that actually there'd be a socialist party or something like that. But instead the term is just used in the sort of broad brushstroke, right? In the post-Cold War world, communist is a little more confusing because a lot of young people don't even know what that is, right? But socialism, which is really the broader term, is sort of what we're thinking about now. And so we can predict the near future, right? There will be further sort of red baiting, right? And a multiracial group of people can sort of have to be mindful of these, right? If we don't want to get sort of caught with our pants down again.
That's right. And I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Sharice Burdenstelli. I don't think she's on the call, but we have hosted her twice. And this is one of her major pieces of study, like the interlockings of race and class, but more particularly like red baiting and anti-communism with anti-blackness and how they're intertwined and used as a weapon and an ideology to basically destroy movements. So, and I also want to invigorate like a late Communist Party leader who many on this call may have known, Henry Winston, who talked about the twin weapons of the ruling class or the monopoly, which was racism and anti-communism. He said we couldn't fight racism with anti-communism. We must fight anti-communism if we want to defeat racism. So it's extremely important. And I'm glad you're discussing the issue here. So I do want to bring up one more question I prepared, and then we'll go into the audience Q&A. So yes, this was more short. So so what role do labor organizers have when confronting white supremacy and racism within the labor movement and the broader working class? And this, similar to the previous question, but I think it's more narrowed on the labor movement itself because, the Wobblies built these interracial unions and, wanted to take advantage of the multiracial working class that was building. So.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very important question. And the answer is that so much is talked about the white working class, which is sort of like a little much because even the white working class is not monolithic either, right? Like within it, there's sort of different groups of people with different politics and all sorts of other different views, different wealth levels, actually. Often sort of education becomes a de facto term for working class. So there can be rich business people who are in fact don't have college educations and somehow they're working class because they don't have a college degree. So we have to be mindful of that, but we also have to know that in fact, there's a long history in the labor movement of racism, right? And that actually comes up to today, right? It's not just in the past, right? I actually think the labor movement has greatly improved over time in terms of organizing immigrants and workers of color and women, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, and it really varies by union, right? But within the labor movement today, any union that is not actively confronting racism is only hurting itself longer term, right? Unfortunately, many of us are selfish, right? We think about our immediate short-term interests, maybe our immediate economic needs for us and our families, in our whatever family that may be defined, and really sort of ignore the rest, yeah? And so the fact that there's a number of labor unions, including actually the East Coast Dock Workers Union, the ILA, which has in the southern ports is actually predominantly African-American, but from Philly on northward is predominantly non-Black. And there are a lot of Trump voters, right? Like there's a lot of people who actually do very well because they inherited a union, don't have much appreciation for essentially why this union emerged as it did, but also in Philadelphia even that there's this radical ancestry, right? And so it's unfortunately not an issue that you can ignore, right? Like some people, or maybe many white people, have tried to ignore it for many generations, and that clearly hasn't worked. It's not like ignoring this issue has resulted in the disappearance of racism, right? And so the obvious solution is attacking it. So one example, Local 8, right? In 1921, there was the Tulsa Race Massacre, 300 Black people killed, now sort of famous because of Lovecraft and Watchmen on HBO, right? Like, but according to newspaper reports, the IWW in Philadelphia held a meeting about it, right? And they talked about, what is this about, right? The Klan and the growth of white racism in Oklahoma is hurting the working class, right? Like, and so they held an educational forum about it in the same way that we're having a forum tonight to talk about these matters. So too, Local 8 did, right? 99 years ago, right? Like, and so the role is we all have to do it, and not just our leaders, right? I mean, we are all leaders, right? The Wobblies were famously decentralized, right? And there's a lot to be said for sort of taking things in your own hands instead of expecting someone else to do the work.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. So we can segue into the Q&A. There's already a bunch of questions that just came up in the last minute or so.
Great.
So I'll go the first one with Ryan Harrison. 2 points you mentioned that helped build the historical IWW, collective work, class identity. A dock worker does not become a ship owner, but some high-wage techno-managerial workers do become modern ship owners, are absent in modern workplaces. What lessons do you draw from the history of the IWW in building worker power today?
Well, I appreciate the question. I don't know if I have great answers to it, but so I would say that um, Ryan is totally correct that, the system, things have changed, right? Like we can't simply sort of try to do what we did 100 years ago. There are actually many occupations that still involve collective work, and or that work that even if you do it individually, that actually there's lots of other people who do the same work. I'm a teacher, right? Well, I'm in the American Federation of Teachers, right? Like, I mean, and so having a shared culture and a shared work experience, there's still some collectivity to it. But I should also note that even dock workers, right, like are less collective in the work that they do. And so Ryan's totally right that technology has changed some matters. I would say the second point, I guess, is, it's true that there are some examples of, I don't know, IT workers rising up and becoming sort of, going public and making a fortune, right? Like there are examples of that. There were examples of that also in the late 19th and early 20th century. Andrew Carnegie was a poor immigrant who was able to become really rich, right? However, most of us don't, right? Like, and so don't be fooled by the examples of Mark Zuckerberg or I don't know who, like sort of rising, to the top. The ruling class loves those examples, right, that they can point to. But I always would tell my students, well, I actually don't know based on the last year in the stock market, but up until recently, 5 of the 10 wealthiest people in America were the children of Sam Walton, right? They just inherited their wealth. Donald Trump inherited as well, right? Like, and so I don't buy into the mobility argument, and we need to sort of educate against that, right? Because the system remains deeply unfair, even though there are individual examples of success, right? Like, and personally, my definition of success is not my individual success, but if we have success, right? And so I think it's also, in America in particular, we live in a very individualistic society, right? Like, and so we have to be mindful of that and keep talking about us instead of just I.
Thank you. And I do want to shout out, I believe Wobblies, at least on the West Coast, are attempting to organize some gig workers. I know for sure, like baristas in Washington State, I believe, or Portland. So I know there is some work around this issue that's being done currently. All right, so I'll go to another question. I'm picking randomly, so apologies if you submitted first. All right, so this is from Jillian McCummins. Can you tell us more about his family? I'm assuming Ben Fletcher. Did he have children? If so, were they union people too? Also, is there a collection of his writings we can access?
So I appreciate the question from Jillian. And the sad point is that we don't have any descendants. So Ben Fletcher, to my knowledge, had no children. I'm pretty certain he had no children, right? Like he was married actually once, and then somewhere along the way got divorced. Don't even know what happened. We know that he then was with a woman for maybe the last 15 years of his life, but they didn't have any children. And she also disappears, right? Like people before me who are interested in Fletcher sort of tried to find family members in the 70s and weren't able to find any. The last known connection to a family member was around the year 2000 when a friend of mine, another historian named William Sorrell, now an older man, got a letter from someone who was a great nephew of Ben Fletcher, who was very proud of his great uncle, even though he said that many people in the family were not, right? That they were sort of ashamed or embarrassed by his radicalism. And of course, he had been in prison, right? Like, I mean, which for most people is sort of not something to aspire to, even though, of course, what Peter Paul and Mayer or someone said, like, have you been to prison for justice, right? Like, and so unfortunately, there's no sort of descendants, right? And I am friends with a man who's in his around 80 who knew Fletcher as a child, right? And to my knowledge, that's about the only person left who has living knowledge of him. Of course, he was a child, but his father was good friends with Ben Fletcher, and thanks to his father, and these are in his book, in my book, I should say, Anatoly Dolgoff's parents, including his father Sam, are sort of featured near the end of the book. And so as for correspondence, there's no sort of Ben Fletcher archives. The book that you may purchase, if you so wish, or have a library purchase, which is even better, right? Like that's basically an archive, right? I have collected almost everything that I have ever found that was written by him or about him. And the book is actually, the majority of the book is those documents that I provide brief introductions to or annotations, right? And so the benefit of that is that readers can be their own historians, right? They can read these documents and sort of think for themselves, right? And his correspondence was limited, right? Like, I mean, or at least what we've saved. The ordinary person doesn't save their records. Nowadays, it's even worse, right? With email and text messages and WhatsApp. The future of historians is dark, right? Because we won't be able to sort of collect all these sorts of things that historically were options. That is what it is, right? There'll be other ways like these sorts of events that perhaps people can capture and then sort of save. We can only hope. But unfortunately, Fletcher didn't have children. Unfortunately, we really don't know what his descendants, well, there weren't any, right, like existed in New York and Philadelphia for the most part. I've tried, not so hard, and failed, right? So the story ends in a way with Ben Fletcher as far as family.
Thank you. This next question, I'm gonna combine two questions which are very similar from Anthony Ryan and Carl Gentile. And it's related to the Communist Party, which was founded in 1919. Whoops, I just lost it. Okay, it was basically on, what was his attitude and position on the CPUSA, and did he ever join? That's basically the gist of the question.
So that's an important question. I will try to be brief. It's actually very complex, but the short version is actually simple. Ben Fletcher didn't like the communists, and vice versa, right? Like, my book, Wobblies of the Waterfront, actually explores this issue in some depth, but like, it's fascinating actually. But while Fletcher was in prison, right, and then got out on bail around 1920, right? He wasn't yet released from prison, but actually a bunch of them got out temporarily, right? In 1920, in the summer of 1920, Philadelphia dock workers were accused by Wobblies in New York City who were communist or communist sympathizers, right? That Wobblies in Philadelphia were loading weapons for the anti-communists in the Russian Civil War, right? Because after the Soviet Union was born, a group of people tried to overthrow the Soviet government called the Whites, right? And so the accusation came down from New York. These Philly guys are loading weapons for the Whites. They are class traitors. They need to be expunged from the IWW. And within a week, that happened. Now it's actually, let me just say off the start, it is not, there's no evidence that they did this. They might have actually loaded weapons aboard a ship. They in fact loaded weapons aboard many ships because that was a major industry in Philadelphia. Whether they were loading weapons aboard a ship that was intended for the enemy of the Soviet Union, there's no evidence either way, right? Like, despite the claim, right? We do know that actually the US was anti-Soviet, was actually sent US soldiers to try to overthrow the Soviet Union, and provided armaments to the Whites. We also know that the Whites were basically getting their weapons out of Siberia, right? And that actually there's evidence that that dock workers found weapons intended for the Whites in Seattle and stopped that shipment, right? Like, although others probably went through, right? In other words, geographically, it would make zero sense to arm the Whites in Siberia from Philadelphia instead of the US West Coast, right? What's going on? So quickly, Local 8 was suspended. Local 8 claimed that they didn't support the Whites, and that they didn't know they were loading weapons, and that they didn't know they were going for the Whites. Again, we don't know actually, but nevertheless, it's interesting, right? So what's happening here? Okay, 1920. The Soviet Union still wants the IWW, which exists in dozens of countries, to join the communist, at that time it was called the Communist International, but Comintern, right? Like, and the IWW and other unions like it in other countries were interested in the Soviets, initially were thrilled at the Soviet Revolution, but started to sort of hesitate because the communists had a very different vision on how to achieve socialism, right? A sort of a small group of people, a vanguard, seize power, right? And then sort of rule in the name of the working class for some time, right? We also know that, anarchists, right? Worker-controlled workplaces, including in the Army and Navy, were being repressed by Lenin, right? Like, and we know that groups of anarchists who were deported from the United States, like Emma Goldman, to the Soviet Union, weren't very happy when they got there, right? Like, and so we also know that Lenin wrote a book called Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder in 1920, where he basically says all communists have to go into the mainstream labor movement. That's where the workers are, right? Like, and so these anarchistic unions like the IWW, but there was also a bunch in Europe, need to abandon themselves and fold, right? And then we also know there was a lot of raiding going on, right? There was a lot of rivalries and increasing tensions, right? Like, and so Fletcher's conclusion out of this I do know, was that the communists basically made up a story. There's no proof that it ever happened, and then quickly suspended the local aid, the most powerful and the only really large Black majority union in the IWW in 1920, right? A number of those people who made those accusations out of New York later joined the Communist Party, right? And we also know that the IWW flirted with the Soviet Union for another year or two, right? And there's actually a lot more to it. But the short version is Fletcher remained vigorously anti-communist to the end of his days. Now, the last thing I'll say about this, even though I'm sure there's questions, right, like about this, is that in 1925, he actually spoke at a communist labor convention, right? And Robin Kelly, in his foreword to my books, speculates, which is very reasonable, I think, is that Fletcher was seen as a sort of a rival to some of the early African-American leaders in the Communist Party who didn't like him, right? And so could Fletcher have sort of entered the communist orbit in the mid-late 20s? It's possible, right? Like it didn't happen, right? I do think about this in the context of the 30s, right? When the Communist Party grows so dramatically, what if Fletcher was in the communists, or maybe more likely, was an organizer for the CIO? Because a lot of Wobblies and communists also worked within the CIO framework to grow unions on a phenomenal scale, right? Like, these are all sort of counterfactual, right? Like there's speculation, but it's interesting to think about. And so Fletcher was not communist. Of course, by the 30s, even before, the communists will rise and become the most dominant force on the left in the United States and around the world. And the Wobblies will diminish, right? Their ideas are influential, including in the CIO and arguably the CP, but will, as an organization, have a fraction of the membership.
Yeah, thank you for the history. And I do want to know, well, from my own reading, I remember in Harry Haywood's Black Bolshevik, his autobiography, there is a section where he talks about Ben Fletcher briefly, and I forgot who was the Black Party member that was working to recruit him, but something happened, and I remember he said, like, yeah, I don't know what happened there, but he ended up not joining. So I remember that being mentioned in Black Bolshevik.
That section in Haywood's book, Black Bolshevik, which is a great book, is in the book too, right? And so
okay,
even
gotcha. Yeah, well, I haven't read your book yet, so sorry.
No, of course I don't expect you to. But like, yes, Haywood mentioning Fletcher, that's actually a very tantalizing, right? Like, because what else was going on? What were they talking about? What was happening? We could only guess, right? There's just sometimes it shows up in the printed record, and it's just a teaser, right? And we wish there was 10 times more, right? Like, but that Haywood section mentioning Fletcher, well, it's like, I wish I, and Earl Browder actually wrote a loving article about Ben Fletcher because they knew each other in Leavenworth, right? Like, and so in the mid-20s, Browder, the head of the Communist Party, will praise and writes a very smart letter about racism in America. That's also a part of the collection I just had.
Thank you. All right, so we have a question from YouTube. Because we always forget to ask our YouTube questions, so make sure I'm doing this right this time. This is from Jimmy Patino, and apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. How might you tie Fletcher into a larger history of Black radicals in the US and global histories? What's a key thing we learned from him in this regard?
Well, that's a great question. It's a big question, right? Like, and so I've tried to sort of, the IWW and Ben Fletcher are sort of lost, right? Like, I've actually spent 25 years in my very, very small way trying to sort of recapture him, if you will, or sort of, but, I'm just one little Joe. And so clearly I have not succeeded very well, right? Like, and so, because like what I do is, well, actually he was a contemporary of A. Philip Randolph, right? Like, Randolph and his partner in his magazine, The Messenger, wrote multiple articles about Ben Fletcher and Local 8, praising the IWW, right? Like W.E.B. Du Bois actually writes briefly about the IWW in his position as editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, right? Like he's a known figure, right? He has to be placed, in my opinion, in the upper ranks of African-American unionists and radicals of his era. You know, how do you compare him and how do you trace him? You know, it's not clear who he was thinking about, right? So we don't know, unfortunately, his inner life, right? I try to then sort of go, well, you know, Randolph, of course, has a very interesting trajectory, and he's now better known in some ways for being a civil rights leader, right? Really, the March on Washington in 1963 was his idea, right? And so he becomes this sort of democratic socialist who's sort of one of the deans who's, I don't know, a senior advisor to Martin Luther King, who was also a democratic socialist, right? And who was also very pro-union. And he surrounded himself with Black lefties like Bayard Rustin as well, right? Like, and so I try to sort of, I think about Fletcher in these sorts of ways, right? And I also like to sort of say, working on something for a news website in South Africa called New Frame, right? That, you know, it wasn't Ben Fletcher, but IWW ideas travel the world literally, as I suggested in my talk, right? But I'll just sort of flesh it out a bit more. In South Africa, Wobbly showed up before 1910, so within 5 years of the birth of the IWW, and bring with them their ideas. How do we know this? Because the IWW motto, an injury to one is an injury to all, increasingly becomes embraced by South African unions, Black unions, right? The first predominantly white union that was anti-racist in South Africa was the IWW. The Communist Party didn't yet exist, right? Like it's before World War I, right? Like, and so, but then through something called the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, ICU, as in ICU, although it's ICU, the letter C, right? Like they adopted the IWW preamble, including the motto, right? And so, and that became the largest Black organization in Southern Africa in the 1920s. There were several 100,000 Black men and women in what is now South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Zambia and Namibia, right? Like, and so there was, the leader of that union was called Clemens Kadali, right? And so Ben Fletcher and Clemens Kadali were both dock workers. Kadali was originally from what's now called Malawi, but he worked in Cape Town, right? Like, and so they didn't know each other, right? To my knowledge, right? Like corresponded or anything. But I think about those sorts of examples of these sorts of revolutionary Black leaders, right? Who used not just social movements, but specifically unions, right, as their tool, right? Like, so that's not a great answer, but it's an answer.
Thank you. This next question is from Cal Colgan, and if I'm following the chat correctly, Cal is a local Wobbly. So this is their question. During the Cold War, the IWW survived by Wobblies more or less joining mainstream unions and pushing them to a more leftist militant direction. The modern IWW has made some gains with building workers' power in key industries in North America, Europe, and Australia, but we are still a relatively small number. How valuable do you think the strategy of dual unionism is today, especially in an era of neoliberal late capitalism when the AFL-CIO strategy of labor peace seems outdated?
So that's a great question, and sometimes also called a dual carder, right? Like, because you have your IWW union card, the red card, and then you have your union card in a union that probably has a contract and probably is a bargaining agent in a specific workplace and industry. And there's dual carders, as Cal knows, I'm sure, in many industries. I would also note that actually that's sort of how the CP operated, right? Like, I mean, at least in the United States, the case I know best, where there were members of the Communist Party who would join other organizations, including unions, right, in order to sort of organize within those, right? So as a strategy, I don't see that makes sense to me, right? Like, whether it's the best strategy, I'm not sure, right? But I think that, like Cal was saying, you know, the IWW has actually been growing. He knows better than me in recent years. The left is growing in the US and worldwide, right? As inequality increases, basically more people start to sort of consider alternatives, basically, right? Like, and so I think that at least in the short term, this dual Carter strategy is wise. And as he also probably knows, as other Wobblies know, you don't need to have a majority of workers in a workplace to actually exert power. Far from it, right? A well-organized militant minority can in fact do that job. And that's also the way it works in the other unions. Forget about revolutionary unions, right? In any institution, in any organization, there's always a small group of people who do most of the work, right? Like that's sort of the sad reality of organizing, right? Like there's paper members, and then there's actually those who are willing to do the work, right? Like so too in unions. And so, you know, if Wobblies are dual Carters and are able to sort of be, I mean, there's so few unions in America, right? If you're so lucky enough to be in a union workplace, right? You can, of course, agitate in order to sort of improve conditions, et cetera. Even if you don't have a union representation, you know, you can push employers in all sorts of ways. And we've heard stories, anecdotal ones throughout the COVID crisis, right? Of workers basically pressing employers to, I don't know, provide better safety equipment, to sort of acknowledge the dangers of COVID, to maybe pay workers more, et cetera, right? And so really organizing within one's workplace, even if you don't have a union, or even if there's another union around, that actually strikes me as sort of the only way forward, right? Like, and then as more people see that you get the goods, right? I mean, I'm a big believer that you need short-term victories before you get long-term goals, right? Like Fletcher, very much so. I'm a sort of a student of Fletcher's, right? Like, yeah, you actually have to fight for a raise, right? You can't just call that sort of some sort of bourgeois sort of demand, right? Because people aren't going to join your revolution until you've delivered some sort of tangibles and demonstrate that you have power, right? Like, and of course, in the short term, we also want to sort of redistribute some wealth downward, right? Like, and so I think that the dual card approach for the IWW specifically is a very wise strategy, but I think it actually is logical for other institutions that want to sort of exert power even when they don't have the numbers.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Sorry if I'm having commentary on some of these answers too. I remember in William Z. Foster's History of the Communist Party of the United States, he had like a chapter or two railing against dual unionism, which he did the same thing, but he kind of like railed against it, seeing it was a mistake. But I don't know if you have a comment on that at all. I'm assuming you've read it, so.
Foster is an important figure, right? Like, I mean, who sort of is a wobbly, but sort of very much believes what Lenin later did, right? Which is why he became a communist, the boring from within, B-O-R-I-N-G. So forget this dual card approach like Cal and I were just talking about. No, you go into the AFL, right? And you start turning, and that actually most famously worked in France, right? Like where the mainstream labor federation, the CGT, has had a very large communist sort of force inside of it, going back a long ways, right? Like, and so I understand the logic of that. You could debate which is better, but as a strategy, I understand it, right? I guess I don't have a strong opinion, but Foster clearly did, as you noted, right? He left the IWW and chose another team, right? Like that he believed was the path forward. I should just note also that Foster was a Philadelphian, right? Like Ben Fletcher, and just a little older, I believe, but like the same community that birthed literally Ben Fletcher also birthed Foster, a radical working class kid who in his autobiography talks about, you know, being radicalized as a kid watching strikes happen, right, on the streets of Philadelphia, right? Like, and so Fletcher would have literally came from the same place.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are two questions from Liana M. That I do want to ask, because I think one of them are asked twice. One is a short answer, then I can ask the second one to follow up quickly. So this is the short one. Given that Ben Fletcher, African-American, was court sentenced to 10 years in prison and $30,000 fine, what kind of court sentencing, if any, did any of his white co-defendants receive? Thank you in advance.
Thank you for asking, because I obviously forgot to mention that everyone who was on trial got thrown in the can, right? Like they all got 10 to 20-year sentences, $10,000 to $30,000 fines. Fletcher was sort of in the middle, right? Some people got longer sentences, some shorter, some got bigger fines, some few less. They were all very long sentences and large fines. And actually by late 1922, everyone had gotten out, and had the sentences commuted, right? Essentially time served, right? Like, and then under FDR, pardoned like 10 years later, right? Like, and so Fletcher's case was the same. He suffered no more nor less in the 1918 trial than others. The funny thing, or sort of sad thing, is that after 4 months on trial, where there's thousands of pages of records, right? The jury came back in under an hour, all guilty on all counts. They probably didn't even talk about individual cases. They were just all guilty, right? And so there's a lot written, not by me, about how unfair the judge was and how unfair the court system was. And the Wobblies actually suffered incredible persecution, not just in this one federal trial, but actually in many trials. There were thousands of Wobblies arrested. And a friend of mine who's a lawyer and professor named Ahmed White has, in the, I don't know if it'll be 2021, but has an important new book on the centrality of repression and destroying the IWW, particularly legal repression, right? The courts, right? Like, and so Fletcher was one of literally thousands of Wobblies. Of course, a lot of Wobblies were also just killed, whether by the bosses or the Klan or the American Legion, right? Because.
Thank you. And then they had a follow-up, well, separate question. If you don't mind, please tell me, what role did the shipping industry, along with the capture and enslavement of Africans, play in the development of capitalism and imperialism?
Well, that's a big question. And so I will give a very short answer, and that is it's crucial, right? Like, I mean, I suggested just a little at the beginning of my talk, but like, I always am trying to do this because if you think about it, when we study history, we often do it within the borders of individual nations. And in the United States, that means that basically whatever happens offshore literally is irrelevant, even though it's absurd, right? Because even hundreds of years ago, the economy was global, right? Especially connected to Europe by way of the short Atlantic Ocean, right? Like, and so, you know, the effective ships that the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then other Europeans start to develop are able to sail the world, and then thanks to the weapons that they've also sort of developed, kill and capture and conquer and claim and colonize, right? Like, obviously, as this questioner noted, one of the many sort of industries was the enslavement of millions of Africans for centuries, from the 1400s into the late 1800s, and bringing them to the Western Hemisphere, right? To do the bidding of really agriculture is in a way the second global industry, right? Like sugar being the most important industry for centuries in terms of generating profits, right? All of that going back to Europe, right? And again, by ship, right? Like, and so literally nothing happens without the ship, right? Even today, there's fewer ships because they're so big, right? But you know, my earlier work does a lot on containerization, but in the 1960s, as containerization emerges, there's been an explosion in global trade in the last 50 years, right? And so even though we might be able to communicate through these devices like we're doing tonight, in fact, the physical movement of stuff continues to be happening at a larger magnitude than ever before in the history of the world, right? Like, and that includes oil, but also all sorts of raw materials and finished goods, right? Like, and so for me, there's a man named Kim Moody who's made these arguments better than me, but we have to understand, in my opinion, the centrality of the logistics industry, right? To understand modern capitalism. And then, in my opinion, right, then you start organizing that industry, right? Like, it's actually one of the more unionized industries, but it could be much more so. Every Amazon driver, right? Every one of these sorts of people who work in the supply chain have as much potential power as dock workers, right? Like, it's not just at that one point in the chain that workers potentially have power. It's just that they're organized and they've used it, right? But transportation from start to finish is actually, that's why the Teamsters, for all their problems, in a way, we got to love the Teamsters, right? Because they've been able to hold on to some power, right? Like, and I'd rather have us have power than them, right? Like, and so, you know, I think the ship is important, but more broadly, even than the ship, is just the industry that is transport, which we now call supply chain or global supply chain or logistics, use different words. We have to organize those people.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, we probably have time for like 2 more questions. So I will, some of these have sort of been answered already, so I probably won't ask them unless there's something specific. Here's a question from Michael Simmons. Do you think it is possible to make teaching labor history more as a mass effort. And I know there's effort by the Zen Education Project, so I do want to shout them out, but go ahead.
Well, before the program formally began, we were talking about Utah Phillips, right? Who was a legendary wobbly and singer, and of course, better known to some younger people as for his collaborations with Annie DeFranco, who's no young person either these days, but young for me, right? Utah Phillips said that basically, what do we get taught in school? We get taught the history of the ruling class. Right? We don't get actually taught the history of the working class, right? And so I would put labor history within the sort of underneath the umbrella of the working class, right? Like, because most workers aren't in unions, right? And so we don't even want to just focus on labor unions. We want to think about sort of non-elites, right? Us, yeah. And so, you know, I do it in all my classes, as my students could tell you, right? Like that it doesn't matter what I teach. We're centering ordinary people and trying to decenter elites. Right. We, of course, have to understand and study elites because they have power and they have influenced us in all sorts of ways. Right. But we want to sort of insert wherever we're able, not just in schools, but of course in schools, right, sort of respect for working people and all that they have done. This is increasingly happening in particular, for example, growing appreciation for the role of enslaved Africans, right, in sort of building the wealth of the country, right? That's why this term racial capitalism is increasingly used, which is, I think, a very effective term to use, right? Like, again, it sort of goes back to Dante and I talking about the race class nexus, right? Like, and so I think we all have to do this, but of course, a lot of us aren't students anymore. So that means that we have to, even outside of classrooms, right, sort of be thinking about the history of work and workers. And of course, almost all of us are that, right? And so to sort of tell working history is to tell the story of us, which hypothetically in a democratic society and world is what we should be doing anyway, right? Like, because hypothetically we're all equal, right? Like, and so we should be studying the masses as opposed to the elite. And we all can try better, right? I'm sure I could do better at that too. Like, even I don't talk much about the IWW classes because there's so much to talk about. And so, you know, but coming back to Utah Phillips, right? We just have to remember that actually we have to unlearn what we have been taught because it's not our history, right? We are taught that in order to not know our history, which disempowers us.
Thank you. And I do have a copy of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Just, I don't know why this, well, I was answering a question from my mother right before this call. And I was like, oh, this book has that answer in here. There's a question about like, yeah, you know, basically repression, like fascist repression in Latin America, but funded by the US, but yeah. Anyways, one more question. Let's see. This one from an anonymous attendee. You talked about IWW's historical opposition to signing contracts. There are some who believe that the IWW should sign more contracts. What do you think Ben Fletcher would think? Additionally, in your research on the Philadelphia dock workers experience in the early 20th century, do you think contracts offer POC workers anything that direct action cannot?
So I'm not a member of the IWW, and so I respect the IWW. I think I'm very praiseworthy, but you know, like, again, sort of, there's always, in my opinion, the short and the long game, right? So in the short term, right, building power, but also that means having better lives in the short term when we're able. And so, like, before the revolution, do I want to make sure that we all have health insurance, right? Like, or actually just abolish private health insurance and create a sort of national health system, right? Like, but like, as far as the contracts thing, well, like, you know, I think this is tricky because unfortunately, again, going back to what I said earlier, some unions are actually anti-universal healthcare because they're worried about their healthcare being diminished, right? Instead of thinking, I want to make sure all of us have healthcare, they're more worried about their healthcare. Well, there's nothing easier for a human being to do than to put themselves first, right? Like, we're animals, right? And so I get that, right? But the genius of humans, in my opinion, the beauty of humans is that we actually are self-aware and can, in fact, be selfless and empathetic, right? The Wobblies were dreamers, right? That's why they're very attractive to a lot of us, right? Is because even if they didn't succeed in their goals, we sort of see in them true believers who sort of were committed to sort of causes that seem to most people just and good. And then sort of paid the price, right? Like, I mean, really paid the price, like repression, 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 right? Like, and so that's a sort of a divergence from do we sign contracts or not, right? Like, but you know, so the Wobblies weren't signing contracts, and I know there's debates within the IWW about this, which I'll defer to because I'm not in them. But I do think in the short term, actually having a contract, I have a contract at my workplace, my faculty union, and my partner is a faculty member, and she's not in a union, and they don't have a union, and she doesn't know what she needs to do to get promoted. I do, right? Because there's actually a transparency to a union contract, right? And so in my opinion, at least in the short term, I'm really glad that I have a union with a contract, right? Like, because it gives me some protection, right? Because otherwise my boss, right, who's this sort of so-called progressive liberal university, right? Like, in fact, acts like a typical employer often and goes, oh, we need to cut costs, we're going to fire some workers, right? Like, so like, now as for the question of do people of color who are workers have some sort of extra benefit from contracts? Honestly, I haven't thought about that in that way. And so I don't know I have a good answer. But I can say that, as we probably all know, that people of color in workplaces suffer more than people in general, right? And so a contract, a union contract, would probably benefit them in particular. And I should note that actually Black and brown workers are overrepresented in the working class and overrepresented in the labor movement, right? Which suggests that actually many Black and brown fellow workers, in fact, seen some benefits to sort of unionism, right? Like,
All right. Well, with that, Dr. Peter Cole, I want to thank you so much for this night uplifting Ben Fletcher's name. Thank you to our co-sponsors, co-hosts, Sankofa Bookstore and the local Wobblies as well. Thank you, Rob, for the tech support as well in the background. And thank you for folks engaging in the chat and providing some great questions. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of them. That's standard for these, and I'm sure, Peter, I don't know if you want to drop your email in the chat if folks want to reach out to you, or you can say some final remarks if you want before I make some announcements.
I want to say that you can find me pretty easily if you do a quick internet search. So I won't put my email up here, but you can find me, and I'm happy to sort of connect with people, also through social media like Twitter or something like that. But you know, I love the fact that Claudia Jones School for Education is doing these sort of talks. They're helping so many of us during these hard times. The fact that the Claudia Jones School would actually sort of entertain and host an event that's sort of about the IWW speaks to sort of a broad, sort of open-minded view about sort of the left in ways that I'm deeply sort of appreciative of and impressed by. And so the only thing I'd say to the people in this group is that you should watch more Claudia Jones, and back when COVID ends or diminishes, go to actual events, because there's nothing better than sort of the best way to organize is in an actual group as opposed to sort of virtually, right? This is good for now. And we all look forward to, of course, maybe 2021 or two when we can do these things face to face and without a mask. So thanks you so much for your attention, and I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, we'll definitely invite you to DC once we're able to. We would love for you to, experience some of our cultural work and all that as well. Which sometimes we're not able to organize on a timely fashion for these events. So, but for those, it'll be way more involved. But I do want to give some last announcements before I let folks go. So the Claudia Jones School is hosting a webinar next Tuesday on December 15th, a forum on community control of the police, specifically for folks in DC. But if anyone wants to learn more about this abolitionist perspective, we will be jointly hosting it with the DC Communist Party, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and Pan-African Community Action. And that's on next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. There's also a demonstration tomorrow in DC, Thursday, December 10th at noon and or 5:30 p.m. for International Human Rights Day at the Department of Justice and Black Lives Matter Plaza in DC. I will share the link in the chat for folks that are here locally. This was forwarded to me before the event, so I want to make sure folks see it. And yeah, follow us on social media, Twitter at Claudia Jones EDU, Claudia Jones School on Instagram, ClaudiaJonesSchool.org is our website where you can catch all of our webinars. You can also look us up on YouTube where all these, all of our webinars are hosted. And yeah, we're excited for more events. And if folks want to drop us a dime too, we're trying to raise some funds so we can make our events more accessible in the future with closed captioning and American Sign Language as well. So I will drop the link for our fundraiser in the chat as well for next year. So thank you, Peter, so much, and thank you for your time. And we hope to see you again. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.